Hello, I'm joined by John Moran for this week's Ukraine update again. John, thanks for joining us this week.
My pleasure.
What have you got for us?
This week, news is coming in of a large scale Russian offensive along the northern front line from Liman to the Russian border at Belgorod Oblast. Now, this will be interesting because it has been mentioned before that should a strike from Russia come, that the speculation was that it would come from Belgorod. So it's interesting now that we see activity there. All week, Russia deployed offensive dominance all along the front line, especially at Bakhmut in Donetsk, where Ukrainian defenders are now almost completely encircled. Fierce fighting also raged at Ugledar, Avdiivka, and Bakhmut. The Liman and Zaporizhia fronts also show increased activity. It's of interest to viewers here might be the backstory of, say, Avdiivka, because we remember that Bakhmut is the central piece of defense along the entire front line, by far the hardest place to crack. Now, Avdiivka is another one. But one of the interesting things about Avdiivka is that is a place where shelling of Donetsk has come from most regularly. So you will find it's a place of dread for the people of Donetsk, and it's one of the main firing points at the city. I would expect that Russian forces will not go easy here. I'd like to mention as well here, according to polls, some 60% of Germans, Austrians, and even Americans are in favor of peace talks and an end to the conflict, which I think is interesting. The other point I wanted to mention again was, now that we know that as far back as 2014, the EU was party to a NATO ruse to fool Russia with peace talks in Minsk, which NATO started, which started off a process of training Ukrainian soldiers for the next 8 years for a war with Russia. Now, the point is that the EU knew this when they were telling us that Russia was the aggressor. So sanctions on Russia could have to be looked at again, given that the EU was not an honest player in this and was not honest with us, the Irish people. Or if they were honest to Leo and Mihal, they certainly didn't pass on that to us. But I think that's a very serious point. There's another very interesting point that came up here. The G20 is meeting in India very shortly. And India is a key country in this whole contest, as we knew from day one when Mihal came home from New York shouting at India to get off the fence. A disgraceful episode. We should have been with India as a neutral country, but no. Now, India has now said that it is hosting the G20 and it is chairing the G20 meeting, and it is not allowing any country to bring up weapons for Ukraine or anything of that nature. It's just about business. So I think that's an interesting development too, are firming up of the those who aren't part of the garden, as it were. Another one feature of note I should mention as well in the attack on Avdiivka, for the first time, Russia has used heavy bombers. each of which can drop a 500 kilogram of explosive from a great height. The effect of these is much greater than even the heaviest of artillery on the ground. They can obliterate the strongest of defenses. And what's interesting is that Russia felt that they could put up these planes safely without any risk to them. So it would appear that the Russians might feel that they have obliterated the defenses that they wanted to obliterate, because any day now, a breakthrough is inevitable, I think.
Okay.
And in other news, China, as we speak, is preparing a position paper on peace in Ukraine. It'll be published over the next few days. And Chinese senior Politburo member Wang Yi announced that Beijing is ready to unite militarily with Russia to defend the national interest of both countries. Again, that's a very serious development, because the pussyfooting is over. And there is a problem, another problem that is added into this febrile mix, which is that Russia has suspended the New START treaty talks on reducing strategic offensive arms. So we're now in a situation where unless we get talks soon, we have a free-for-all in the international sphere. This whole thing has messed up world relations, I think, forever. The system is broken, and I don't think it's going to work again. The non-white European American world will not put up with us any longer, I don't think.
Yeah, that's some summation for the week, and that's some developments. That's the first time that I've come across utterances from the Chinese government to the effect that they would be willing to participate in military co-defense. Now, they have had recent war exercises together, but they have never made, to my knowledge, statements like that. We do actually have an image that's in some ways comical on the issue of the meeting between Lvovsk and Yi, but at the same time, there's a serious satirical element to it as well. They're both laughing, and Lavrov is saying, and then Biden says, "Russians, we do not wish you harm." And they're just laughing at the idea that anybody could believe anything that the US
Yeah.
would say currently. Just before we focus on that a little bit more, John, I'd just like to go back. You mentioned about the bombing of Donetsk city, which has no military importance whatsoever in the war, but has been bombed persistently since 2014, really. But since the commencement of these military actions and maneuvers, it's been bombed with cluster bombs, with mines, and a lot of civilians have been killed and injured. And this is ongoing, and it's never mentioned in the news. You have some footage from a bombing in Donetsk this morning. We'll just have a quick look at that.
Once again, I mean, you could show this footage every day of the week in Donetsk city, because it is being bombed from places like Avdiivka, which are heavily dug in, so heavily dug in fact, that it's taking so long to get past them. But I will say in Bakhmut, the Russians have taken 5 kilometers of land in their offensive, and that's quite large. So the Bakhmut trap is closing, or has closed.
Yeah. Just staying with Donetsk City for a little second, and we'll move on to Bakhmut. From my observations and from the reporting coming out of Donetsk and clear video footage that is indisputable, it looks like they're just lobbing missiles all over the city. There's no strategic plan to it. There's no way. It's almost like they just want all the civilians to flee out of that city, because it's shops, it's shopping streets, it's buses. I've seen videos of absolute carnage on the streets of Donetsk, but there doesn't seem to be any military objective in doing it?
Well, unfortunately, in this country, we have a particular dislike of violence, of war, because of our history of we were downtrodden for almost 1,000 years. So it's not unnatural we'd have a particular aversion to any form of violence, which is why uh, you'll have people like Micheál Martin and all others will go to Enniskillen and various other places to show their concern for deaths that have taken place. Well, where is that concern for the people of Donetsk?
Mm.
What have they done to deserve this?
Quite the opposite, in fact. Rather than concern, there seems to be concealment, and avoiding at all costs, even acknowledging that something like that is happening in Donetsk. The people that the Irish government are more and more supporting in a military way. Just to move on to Bakhmut, John, I know you wanted to focus on that a little bit. It's been months on months essentially under siege now. Is that siege finally coming to an end?
Well, I have a slight suspicion that the final evacuation of Bakhmut was awaiting the departure of Joe Biden because it might have been embarrassing prior to a visit from him should they have evacuated, because it is essential, according to Zelensky's view, that they give a positive sound, a positive note on how things are going. Otherwise, they won't get more weapons. And the tragedy is, if they get more weapons, more and more of them will die. I
Mm.
mean, it's something like 5 to 6 to 1 ratio on the front line of Ukrainian to Russian deaths. So even if it stays as it is without any advance for the Russians on the front line, if every day they maintain that particular advantage, they win. They don't have to move.
Mm. But even when they do fall back eventually and they do give up Bakhmut, they will try to promote that as some kind of an advance. It seems to be the nature of the Ukrainian military propaganda machine and the Western media machine that they will put that down as an advancement in some way, as opposed to what it really is.
Well, an awful lot of what you get from the Ukrainian side is PR. And it's coming from Zelensky. I mean, it's his business. He has his Kvartal 95 studio company still making films during this imbroglio. Um, but even now, some of his friends, even in the Irish government, in European governments, I have no doubt we have reached a point where we won't go any further, or we don't want to go any further. I think we've reached that point. There's never any agreement in Europe now on sanctions. They always break up in disagreement. The United Front is breaking up.
And so, do you think with these utterances of unity from the likes of Biden, I see Giorgia Meloni visiting Kiev this morning. Do you think these utterances are really a case of the lady doth protest too much, and that in reality, behind the scenes, they're actually getting ready to cut ties?
Well, I suspect in the not too distant future, those who rushed off to Kiev will be embarrassed that they had done so when it is revealed the full extent of what happened in Ukraine. And that's forget about the war. I mean, even in their chemical labs where they're processing, doing very heavy experiments that would not be allowed in the United States, they do them there,
Mm.
offshore. And they have made sure they have taken all that they could out of Ukraine while they were departing from places before the Russians arrived. Although there is an SBU, a former SBU, which is Ukrainian special branch, if you like, officer who has defected to the Donbass side, and he has some very good information on them.
What was the nature of that information, John?
Well, I got a contact from someone on a Donbass channel, and they asked, would I be interested in hearing what he has to say? He had some very interesting information. And I said, I'd be interested, all right, but I mean, I only tweet and do that sort of thing. And they have me banned again at the moment. This is the 77th Regiment, the British Army unit.
The info war unit.
They're the ones who are monitoring our stuff.
Yeah, but this guy, this retired or this defected SBU guy, what was the nature of the type of information? You don't have to go into detail, but the nature of the information that he had.
Well, if you know the SBU and what they are engaged in, and especially what they've been engaged in this past 8 years, when all of this was being planned. I mean, he has all that information, And it would make a good interview, I think, but there's nothing I can do with it.
Yeah, we might make contact with that guy. In the meantime, John, you mentioned earlier on about the meeting between the foreign ministers of Russia and China, respectively, Lavrov and Yi. There have also been today the beginning of actual trilateral naval exercises between Russia, China, and South Africa. So the European continent, the Asian continent, and the African continent, members on those continents, dominant members working together, the most dominant economies in those areas working together in a military and naval fashion for self-defense. What do you make of that?
Well, I think what we're seeing there is the future, because South Africa is perhaps the dominant country in South Africa, and it's leading the way. The terrible thing that Europeans have forgotten is that they did dreadful things in Africa, and the Africans don't forget that sort of thing. While they might go home to Europe and forget all about their African adventures, they haven't been forgotten there. So they know whose side they're on in this particular case. And it's not the side of the white, what shall I say?
Continuing colonialist, because there is still
new colonialism, because this is what Ursula von der Leyen is planning for the future, that Europe, moves into African minerals. We know what that's all about. Yeah. The problem with Africa and the problem with elsewhere is that European and American countries have been ripping them off for too long. They need to be looked after, not exploited. And exploiting them isn't the way forward if Ursula von der Leyen thinks it is.
We drive all of their youth out to work in low-paid jobs in Europe and the United States and places like that.
And to be looked down on, and all of that. I mean, if you look at this whole thing of world population and all this comes into the Russian-Ukrainian war and all that as well. I mean, you saw recently there was some friction in Irish society, because a huge number had been brought in last year, and there was friction. Of course, there was friction. I mean, if you dump people into an area like Ainger Street, where I live, and there's several hostels for down and outs and drug addicts and all the rest of it, and all the state can think of about the area is to dump places in it. So the locals are upset about this. There's nothing for the locals, nowhere for there's a small little square patch where kids can play football, but nothing else.
Mm.
And it's a vast inner city area with the highest number of blocks of flats in the country.
Mm.
So but that friction that was exposed led to a march by nice people in Dublin, and they were all nice people, and they had the best of intentions, that they like foreigners and things like that. But it doesn't move the situation an inch.
Yeah,
The
yeah.
situation will still persist. I mean, if RTE, who was advertising that march since early morning, for the first time I remember them advertising a march, they're usually trying to downplay them, but they were advertising them. So they wanted to happen. And, you know, we could have all gone down with placards saying, "We mean well," and chanted it, but it's meaningless.
Yeah, yeah.
The problem that was caused by the government failing to prepare and make way for the numbers. It was even fewer numbers than they thought were coming, 70,000 instead of 100,000.
But
And
isn't
yet
the
they
government still fanning the flames of war in Ukraine and continuing to create the environment where people feel that they have to flee? So it's
Oh,
not just the case they
absolutely.
fail to prepare. They are a part of the contributing voices to this narrative.
Well, it's only a matter of time before the news comes out from all around Ukraine of the numbers of young men that have died so far, because it is phenomenal. I'm sure you've seen all the massive graves with flanks of flags, Ukrainian flags, into the distance, all of them young men. And that's everywhere. And they think they're winning.
Yeah.
They've been told that they're winning. They are not. And they've been hammered for a long time. They've been lied to.
Mhm.
We've been lied to.
I often maintain that the people of Ukraine are, in many respects, being held hostage by the government that's in Kiev at the moment, in terms of the information that they've been provided, but also in terms of conditions that have been set by this government, in which there's no free press, there's no free opposition, political opposition. People are being disappeared. People can be beaten on the street because they don't support this war. People are afraid to talk. So I maintain that people are being held hostage indeed. John, do you want to finish up with anything before we go this week?
Well, I would like just to continue what you're saying there.
Yeah.
We think that BlackRock has bought up about 20% of Ukrainian farmland, you know. What they're doing is they're selling off Ukraine. This is like a fire sale. Zelensky is a horrible little man who is allowing his countrymen and women to die in huge numbers so that he can escape to Florida to a mansion, or he might go to the one that he has in Italy, or spend his €1 billion elsewhere.
Mm.
That's what he's doing. He's building his bank balance.
I suppose when it comes to wars, whether it's the First World War, the Second World War, the Vietnam, if there's any war we can mention, Iraq, there are the oligarchs and the billionaires who will sit back rubbing their hands, and the shareholders, so people who've got pensions and their shares are, they'll sit back rubbing their hands thinking, oh, what a wonderful war.
Well, when you think, I mean, the best example of that is the defense secretary, the U.S. defense secretary, who was responsible for all things military, including this war. He came straight from Raytheon, one of the big war companies, and they had to change the rules so that he could come direct, because there had been a law that you had to wait 5 years before you could be on a government role after being on the board of a company. But they changed it for him. So he is the guy now, big war, minister for war.
And nobody knows who he
And
is.
he's a shareholder
Yeah, but
in
nobody.
Raytheon.
He isn't even a known personality. He was taken straight from a company. That to me, that's from an economic, philosophical point of view. That's fascism. That's when companies directly direct government.
It is fascism, and it's happening all over the place. People are moving in and out of government from big war companies, from big tech companies, from big pharma companies, from Wall Street. It's a revolving door. For that, meanwhile, back at the ranch, Joseph and Josephine Soap in the United States, their conditions are worsening, and their government just wants war. Will put any amount of money into war, no money into healthcare, no money into building up the country that has fallen so far with the kind of economics that it has had this past 20 years.
Mm. But they're continually being told by their government that things are getting better. And they've been told ridiculous lies. For instance, X amount of jobs have been created since Biden took power. But in reality, what's happened is the pandemic restrictions are over. And so existing jobs were just restarted again. But he's trying to claim some kudos for that. John, we're running out of time. Do you want to finish up with anything this week?
Yeah, just those jobs that you refer to there. Some people have three of them to go to it every day, and they're still not making enough.
Oh, I'll tell you one thing, and I work, and I'm sure you work at this kind of stuff uh, Monday to Monday to 10, 11, 12 every night, and we don't get a penny for it. But we're happy in what we're doing because we believe we're part of a cause to get free speech and balance out there to people.
Well, I'm a great believer. My motto is my heart is where the hurt is.
That's a good motto.
Wherever there is hurt, I want to fix it or do something maybe to make an effort. Well, that's my motto.
And maybe just stand on the toes and cause a little bit of hurt to the big and the powerful.
Oh, with them, I don't care about them. You know, I have no problem hurting them.
John,
They, they call.
I'll see you next week for next week's update.
Okay, Finbar. Bye
Thank you,
bye.
John.